Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope you are all having a really wonderful day today. It is my great pleasure and privilege and honor to be able to talk with you today about a very special and interesting film that is directed by a very special and interesting filmmaker-director. The film that I would like to talk with you today about is this film, which is called Dark Star, and it is a film that is directed by John Carpenter. (1974's Dark Star, directed by John Carpenter, written by Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon. It's a story of a ship that is in the deep reaches of space called Dark Star, manned by a crew of 4 men, Doolittle, Pinback, Talby, and Boiler, trying to find unstable planets to blow up in order to make certain regions of space safe for future colonial efforts on the part of the people of Earth. What a wonderfully weird, comic, tragic, sad, and quite poetic film that this is. That description might suggest that this film might seem to be all over the place. And in fact, perhaps some people who don't like this film or are critical of this film might consider this film to be all over the place tonally. But I think this is a film that has that great distinction of being a film that really improves over time and with every watch. The more I watch this, the more I love this film, which is to suggest that the first time I saw this film, I really actually thought it was just okay. I didn't like it as much. But as time passed and I watched the film more and more, I began to love it more and more. And so it's one of those films that has this really odd, uncanny, and quite brilliant way of growing on you the more time one gives to it. So this is Dark Star, and it is a very special film in many respects, and hopefully I'd like to talk about that with you today. Before I continue, what I'd like to show you is this is the Blu-ray version that I have. This is the Japanese Blu-ray edition, which comes in this box set right here. So this is Dark Star, and the disc comes here. And it comes with this interesting paraphernalia inside. We've got the booklet here. We've got Commander Powell there, and we have interesting pictures that come in this booklet, certain artwork and essays in English and Japanese, and also other mentionings in Japanese, of course, because this is a Japanese release. But it's really well presented. Lovely pictures here, as you can see in the back of the booklet here. Really lovely. And then we have, I haven't taken them out of the plastic, but these are postcards of Dark Star. There are a number of them in here, and I haven't taken them out yet because I don't want to do that quite yet. But these are postcards that are included. And then you have the 2-disc Blu-ray here. And what we have is something very special. We have the what's known as the 83-minute cut that was released in theaters, and then we have the shorter labeled here as being the 71-minute version that was prepared after the fact. So yes, so it's the 83-minute version and the 71-minute version that we have on the disc. And then we also have on the second disc supplements, which is the documentary I think in English it's called Let There Be Light. And so there's a documentary on that, which I think appeared on U.S. releases of this film. It's a long documentary, quite good, filled with a lot of background. John Carpenter doesn't appear directly, but there are, I think, archival interviews that are included with this documentary. So there's a lot of information about this, and the relationship between the filmmakers and USC, and all the history of the production and the release and all that. So really interesting stuff. Plus, there are also interviews with cast and crew included on the supplements disc. So this is the Blu-ray release of Dark Star in Japan, and I'm very fortunate to have it. And I will be now talking about this film. I will be talking about the longer cut and also the shorter cut, and there are some differences that I think are worth mentioning that might make a difference in terms of how this film is being presented. And so I will try to make references to those where appropriate. But this is the point in the video where I'd like to say, if you haven't seen the film Dark Star, please turn off this video and watch the film, and you can always come back to this video after you've seen the film. I don't want to spoil this for you because there are a lot of supreme joys and surprises along the way if you haven't seen it. So it can be a lot of fun, and I think much of that fun might be spoiled if you watch this video before seeing the film. So please stop this video and you can watch the film and always come back at any time, because the video will still be here, at which time it's my pleasure to talk with you about this very interesting film, Dark Star. Okay, so you're back. So that means that you've seen the film Dark Star, at least one or more versions of it. So what can we say about this film, except that let me start by building off of what I was mentioning earlier, which is I think this is a film that ages, I think, quite well. Maybe not in terms of the special effects, because the special effects are, granted, somewhat dated in terms of comparing this science fiction work to, for instance, science fiction films post-Star Wars, shall we say. So yes, there is a bit of dating that's going on with respect to the special effects, don't get me wrong. But the concepts that are included here, some of the sequences that are included here, the way in which characters are interacting and developed, and the way in which things sort of are built up and then fall apart quite spectacularly. All this stuff is combined in a way that I think gives the film a real bite and edge that makes the film long-lasting, and it makes the film age very, very well, very gracefully. There are elements, for instance, about artificial intelligence, AI, which I think are very relevant to today's climate, 2019. There are elements about aggression and about military aggression that I think are still relevant today. There are things about how people react and act under pressure and under severe cases of stress, which is relevant today. There are things here about how do men react when they're enclosed in a confined space and they're under a certain deal of stress in terms of performing some kind of mission. And this is something that I think we'll see played out in future Carpenter works, right? Maybe to some extent in Assault on Precinct 13 and also perhaps Escape from New York. But I think supremely we will see that played out par excellence in his masterwork, The Thing. But we see hints of that quite vividly here among these characters, and the solitude that is generated, what they are doing in order to pass the time. And oh, believe me, there is a lot of time that needs to be passed in the universe of this film, and how they are fighting boredom, what they are doing in order to stay sane, these sorts of things. This can take a comic turn, this can take a tragic turn, this can take quite a philosophically profound turn in many respects. And so this, I think, is an entire package that is then layered by the way in which the music has that eerie synthesizer science fiction dark mood that gives it, I think, a further futuristic modern edge. This is all to say that it's a complete package of a film that ages very well, and I think still continues to entertain and provoke and become a great cause of conversation among cinephiles. Dark Star is a really surprisingly good work that deserves its cult following quite well. I should say also that some of the characterizations here are quite excellent. We have the characters drawn out very well. We have Doolittle, who is the new leader of the crew after the death of Commander Powell due to some kind of accident, when they're in hyperdrive. But we will see Commander Powell later, of course, in deep freeze at a very key moment when they're trying to figure out how to stop Bomb 20 from detonating while it's still attached to Dark Star. And the key is to teach it phenomenology, right? But we have Doolittle, who I think is in many ways a very inappropriate person to act as commander of this crew, because there are instances where I think he shows where he is an inappropriate leader. When he is talking with Talby, and Talby is trying to indicate to Doolittle about how Talby thinks he has found the source of the malfunction, or at least, or as Talby would say it, the malfunction. And so, but Doolittle doesn't really take Talby seriously. And remember, this happens twice in the film, right? This happens the first time when they are together alone in the glass, the shell of the glass top of the ship. It's just Talby who's been sitting there by himself, looking at the stars, wondering about the stars, and that's what he likes to do. He doesn't like to go down below with the rest of the crew. And this is the great scene between him and Doolittle. And when Talby says he thinks he might have found the source of the malfunction, Doolittle seems to basically brush him off and say, we'll worry about it when it turns into a serious problem. Now that is a terrible thing to say if you're a leader of this crew, of this space mission. I mean, if you find a potential for error or malfunction, you should get to the root cause of it immediately. But Doolittle doesn't seem to have any interest about that. At the point in the film, of course, he's thinking only about his board and how he loves to surf. And of course this comes up again later in a very critical scene when they're about to launch bomb number 20, and while Boiler and Pinback and Doolittle are in their little control room there, at the same time Talby is wandering the airlock with his spacesuit on. He thinks he's identified the source of the malfunction, but while he's trying to communicate with Doolittle basically turns off the communication because he's so focused on the launch of bomb number 20. So that's another indication. I think had Doolittle not turned off that communication, they might have saved a lot of trouble, and in fact they would have probably saved the ship from blowing up there, because they probably would have found out the reason why bomb number 20 was malfunctioning the way he did, or malfunctioning the way he was doing, was because it was having to do with this thing that perhaps could have been fixed had they been listening to Talby and what he was trying to find in the first place. Which brings up another great point. This film is, as I mentioned earlier, this is a kind of film that seems to be a precursor to what we will see in John Carpenter's work, The Thing, with respect to how men communicate with each other in times of stress and isolation and claustrophobia. And I think this is played out very, very well in this film. This idea of communication, or lack thereof. We saw this in this idea of Talby and Doolittle. And in fact, we see this with Talby as well. When when he's trying to communicate at the end of their first, at the end of the pre-credit sequence, when we see them jump into hyperspace after launching bomb number 19. After they jump out of it, Talby is trying to communicate with the rest of the crew, but he's unable to do so. I think that's a great metaphor for the inability to communicate properly among the men, and we can, I think, trace that to the root cause of what happens at the second half of the film, which basically everything goes to chaos and everything just falls apart quite spectacularly. Well, I think we could attribute that to the fact that there was poor communication from the outset. And it's true not only between Talby and Doolittle, of course, and it's true not only with respect to Doolittle's leadership skills, but also with respect to Pinback, Sergeant Pinback. The Dan O'Bannon character. There is that scene right after he basically does away with the beach ball alien, and he's now they're trying to, is it chicken or ham that they're going to eat? And so he's talking about how he was surprised how the alien basically shot through the air like a balloon, and then he's going into his story about how he was just a fuel technician, and because he had a low score, he didn't have a high enough score to become a qualified astronaut. And then one day he saw an astronaut kind of go crazy and jump in one of the tanks, and he took off his suit and jumped into one of the tanks. And so Pinback tried to save him, but he had to put on his suit first. And then as soon as he put on his suit, then he was called to the ship because he thought he was the person who had jumped into the tank. Well, therein lies the whole reason why Bill Frug becomes Sergeant Pinback. Right? Because it's not really Sergeant Pinback. But no one listens, right? Or I should be more clear, Boiler and Doolittle seemed to say, isn't this the same thing he was saying 4 years ago? So they don't listen to what he's saying, but they are concerned more with the fact that he's just mouthing off like usual. Well, it's the same old thing from Sergeant Pinback. But this, again, goes towards this idea of lack of communication among the men, and it's played, I think, for comic effect, especially when we have it in the context of Sergeant Pinback, but it's also played, I think, for very tragic effect when we realize what happens to Talby and then how things just disintegrate into nothingness. And in fact, the final scene, the final sequence is when Talby and Doolittle are shot into space, and they are basically falling away from each other because Doolittle is hurling towards the planet. He's going to be burned up when he hits the atmosphere, while Talby is going in the opposite direction because he's been enclosed in the Phoenix asteroids, and then he's going to be going away with them, what we assume to be for all eternity. But it's wonderful because that line of communication between the two of them slowly fades as the distance between them becomes wider and wider. And I think that's a great metaphor for this idea of trying to communicate but being unable to. And when you are unable to communicate, all you are left with is this notion of solitude and being alone and being isolated. For some people, I think it can turn one mad. I think if you have someone like Sergeant Pinback, he seems to be a character that wants to have communication. He seems to want to have the stimulus of the company of other people, and he's frustrated that he's not getting it the way that he wants. But at the same time, you have other characters like Talby and Doolittle in particular, who seem to relish in this idea of solitude and isolation and being alone and wanting to do what it is they want to do. And I think that's encapsulated perfectly by the film's end and the way it ends. The idea of communication, or the inability to communicate, of course, plays itself out in other ways. I think quite strikingly, of course, is the conversation between the crew, in particular between Pinback and also Doolittle, with bomb number 20, right? And this idea of Commander Powell's, right? In order to avoid the situation of the bomb blowing itself up and the crew and the ship Dark Star, you must teach it phenomenology, right? In the words of Commander Powell. And so what does this mean? We must try to teach it to think about sort of existential crisis, and this idea of how does it know that, how does it confirm its existence? How does it know what it is that it knows when it can't confirm the existence of anything outside of itself? Right. And this is both a good and a bad thing too, because on the one hand, they're trying to communicate this notion to the bomb, which at the point of the start of this crisis, the bomb doesn't realize this notion that it later learns. Right. So it's a step of the development of learning of this particular machine, this artificial intelligence. But this act of communicating this idea becomes quite chaotic, right, in more than one way. On the one hand, we have Doolittle trying so desperately to reason with the bomb. He's out there alone, face to face with the bomb in space, and he's trying to reason with it. But it becomes a kind of philosophical debate, if you will, between man and machine. And we don't know until the very last minute whether his acts of communication will succeed. So there is an example of the struggles of communication, if you will. This is also then juxtaposed with the scenes between Boiler and Pinback, where Boiler comes up with the idea of, okay, man, I'll take the gun and I'll shoot the locks off the bomb so the bomb will fly away from the ship, where Pinback seems to think that that's a very dangerous idea, and it's quite reckless, and so he's trying to avoid that from going on. And you can see they're trying to reason with each other, but they're talking over each other because there's not much time, because the countdown has commenced. It's almost reaching its point of explosion, detonation, and so you can see they're talking over each other while Boiler's trying to get the gun and Pinback's trying to struggle free and trying to wrestle the gun out of Boiler's hands and all that stuff, and he shoots and it hits the wall and all that stuff, and he punches Boiler, and all that chaos is going on. Well, yet this is another example of the lack of communication that plays itself out under this situation of stress and claustrophobia. So this is also a way in which we see how men react under pressure. And again, we will see this played out in John Carpenter's future works, in particular The Thing. So already I think we can see that there is much going on in terms of rich thematic exploration that makes this film much more than just a kind of a cheesy, low-budget sci-fi film, entertainment. But it is an entertainment as well, and a good one, and a funny one, and it provides a lot of great varying tones, one of which being this idea of slapstick comedy. I think the sequence between Pinback and the alien is one of the great slapstick comic moments in John Carpenter's filmography. I mean, the way the tables are turned when Pinback is trying to control the alien, but in fact it's the alien who is controlling the situation and leads him through the shaft and into the elevator shaft and all that stuff, and the broom that happens earlier, and Pinback quite cleverly randomly pulling out a squeaky toy mouse, I think. So, and all the stuff about being stuck in the elevator and trying to blow himself out of it and all that, and the elevator coming up and down, and all this physical humor. It's like a silent film It's like Harold Lloyd or Buster Keaton or something. It's really quite remarkable, the kind of physical prowess that Dan O'Bannon as an actor portrays and shows us here. It's really quite great, and we have him playing off what is essentially this jumping beach ball with hands, but it's a remarkable sequence, and it's very famous, and it's always quoted. That's the sequence that's always quoted when people are talking about Dark Star, right? It's the film with the beach ball alien or something. Well, I think people mention that for a reason, right? Because it always sticks out. I think a main reason why it sticks out is because the way in which Dan O'Bannon, the actor, takes care of that sequence is actually quite remarkable. He deserves much credit for that. And I mean, it's probably, I don't know if we could call it necessarily laugh out loud funny, although I think there are moments when there are potentially laugh out loud moments. But I think more generally, and this is one of the reasons why I think this film will last, is because we can see a great prowess of his his physical acting. We can also see certain elements of the shots and the way they're composed that creates this smooth sense of chaos, if you will. And it's funny, but then it ends on quite a downer of a note, right? When he comes in with the gun and he basically shoots the alien dead. It's a really sad note. It's a sad way to end a sequence that is very funny, or potentially very funny, in a slapstick comedy silent film kind of way. So that is a great example of how this film shifts in tone, and how it plays with our sympathies and our expectations in a way that I think generates, I don't know if maybe it was on purpose or not, who knows, but for whatever the reason, it's undoubtedly clear, right? It generates this real sense of sadness, of pathos, that I think explains the reason why sometimes this film is referred to perhaps as Waiting for Godot in Space or something like that. The idea of exploration of ennui and malaise, and how it turns sour and it takes a tragic turn. Not only do we see this in the fate of the Dark Star ship, but also just in these little moments about how the characters cannot connect with each other, how Pinback very ruthlessly kills this alien, and it was his idea to take the alien on in the first place because he thought it was necessary for the ship to have a mascot, right? And this is the reason why the ship's computer basically chastises him for not wanting to feed the alien, right? It was his idea, it's his responsibility, which is also a great moment too, right? Because that's the moment where the ship's computer says it's time to take care of the alien, and it's Pinback's responsibility, but Pinback doesn't want to do it. But the ship's computer basically fights back and says, no, it was your idea, so you have to do it. So that's a great moment of the ship's computer showing a little bit of how should I put it? It's almost like the ship's computer with the woman's voice. She is showing her own level of intelligence, artificial intelligence, also on display at that moment. It's not just bomb number 20. It's also the ship's computer. So I thought that's a great moment as well. But the point is that it was Pinback who wanted to bring the alien on in the first place, and he realized it, as it grew bigger, it grew uglier, and then I guess it became easier to kill it. But I think that's a really sad turn. It's very tragic, actually, in a small, quiet way, I suppose, but nonetheless quite tragic, which gives this film, again, another edge that helps to make it, give it a longevity that I think will last for many years. I think we should also talk about the differences between the longer original theatrical cut and the shorter cut of the film. And I think the major differences that I can identify are that the shorter cut doesn't include the sequences, for instance, of Doolittle and his musical instrument that he has made with string and all that. There is a shot in the longer theatrical cut of the three of them in their barracks and the bed, and the shots of the nude women on the wall, and there's this is another sequence where we see the joking nature of Pinback, and he's fooling around with a rubber chicken or something like that. Well, that's not in the shorter cut. In the shorter cut, we also don't get the sequence where early on with the blue asteroid storm that the ship runs into, and they have to set up the defense mechanisms manually because last time they entered the storm, the ship's computer suffered some damage, so the ship's computer couldn't control it this time around, so it has to be all done manually. And we see the shots of them glowing red, and then we see a bolt of lightning that hits the back of the ship, and it causes, I think, a bit of damage, which I think is the root of the malfunction that Talby later identifies. This sequence happens around the time when we see the shot of the three of them, head banging to the surf music, right? In the shorter cut, we don't get all the scenes with the storm and the damage. We go from the head banging surf music immediately to the shot or the sequence of Talby and Doolittle talking in the glass dome up there. So in between that, we get the large sequences there about the storm and about some other sequences that pad out the film. And I think that's interesting because the longer theatrical cut with the storm and we see the root cause of what happens and the damage that is incurred, I think we can that lends itself very nicely to the interpretation of the longer cut about the root cause of the problem, it being an external reason. In other words, it was the fact that the ship went through the storm that caused the problem in the first place. And so that brings us further away from the interpretation that this film is at its heart about the way in which human beings are unable to solve the problems that they themselves are the cause of, right? And you can't really have that interpretation if the film shows us the reason that the malfunction occurred in the first place, which is this bolt of energy, I think. Well, if we don't have that in the shorter cut, what happens, therefore, in the shorter cut is that we have a more potential to... We don't see the reason for the malfunction or the malfunction. We can kind of get a sense of what it is because the ship is starting to be run down, very early on there. They don't get the radiation shields that they needed. Also, there's mention of the fact that the storage unit that had all the ship's toilet paper was destroyed, so they don't have toilet paper and all that. So there's this idea of the ship falling apart. And incidentally, that idea of not having toilet paper, that is a brilliant thing to include, right? It's probably like a low humor moment, perhaps, for some people. I completely understand that. But on the other hand, it's such a great human moment, too, because, I mean, who can't sympathize with this idea of not having toilet paper, right? I think this little thing of having toilet paper, not having toilet paper, can make all the difference in the world in terms of one's mood, one's feeling of sanitation, of course, cleanliness. Without toilet paper, you don't get that sense, and so it adds a certain human element, a further means by which we, the viewers, can access the world and get at what these people are thinking and feeling. And already by the film's start, we realize that they are really on edge, and there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of bad vibes going on. Who knows? Perhaps it all had to do with the fact that there was no toilet paper. Who knows? Anyway. But back to my earlier point, which is I think the shorter cut with the fact that it doesn't show us this external reason for the cause of the malfunction is lends itself very nicely to the possible interpretation that the source of the problems were all caused by human error, and therefore it's up to the humans to try to solve it. But the fact that they are unable to solve these errors brings about their destruction. And so in that respect, I think the shorter cut serves an interesting interpretive function, whereas the longer cut pads it out in a way that gives us more story and more special effects, and also I think a different line of interpretation. The externality of a crisis situation causing internal turmoil, which thus leads to destruction. I think that is an equally valid interpretation to give, and I think it's quite a valid one to make when you're talking about, in particular, the longer theatrical cut. But there you go. I suppose we could conclude with some just remarks about the film in general, and then we can go from there. So I think we should make a note of the music as well. Not only do we have this great eerie tune that we understand is credited as being by John Carpenter, and of course John Carpenter is known for his musical themes, and we will see this played out in his future films. But here we have this dark, sinister synthesizer score theme that isn't light and happy, but in fact it's very sinister and eerie. And this is played even over the so-called comic scenes with the alien and the elevator shaft. But it's also, I think, it gives us a sense of something that is not quite right. This feeling of always being on edge, which I think is really great. It's a great early soundtrack from Carpenter. But also we should mention the great use of the song Benson, Arizona at the very beginning and the end. So much so that it makes me want to visit Benson, Arizona one day before I die. Maybe another bucket list entry for me. But it's so iconic, the way that song is used, both at the beginning and at the end. I should also mention that there is a great, I think there is a great underlying social critical commentary, if you will, this idea of how the government is refusing to help them with the radiation shields. There is a lot of stuff about the military-industrial complex here. The crew, and in particular Doolittle, seem to be bent on trying to find a planet to destroy. I mean, they want to destroy stuff. They're like boys with toys, as it were, and they just want to destroy stuff. And I think that is, and they are doing it for a kind of U.S. government purpose, perhaps. So I think this is, we can't escape the possibility that this is some kind of social critique or commentary, especially when you consider that this film is in the early 1970s, and we consider certain aspects of U.S. and world history at that time. I think the metaphor is unescapable, or inescapable, as it were. So there is that as well. Also, I should say that the special effects I mentioned at the very outset of this video, I think, are quite ropey and very dated. But at the same time, there is a nice charm about those special effects. You know, there is a great, almost homemade feel, and homemade feel almost to the sense that things are beginning to fall apart. You know, things are starting to peel off. You get that sense that panels are beginning to fall apart. Things are enclosed in these weirdly shaped, claustrophobic small spaces, and everything is flat outside, and there are moments where things kind of flash in a very staccato way that's not quite natural, at least how we would understand things to play out in the normal world, you know, the world that we're living in. And so there is this weird off-kilter feeling about the special effects and the claustrophobic nature of the sets and all that gives this film, again, the further fuel for this idea that things are being run down, things are falling apart, and that it becomes, I think, a great symbol for the characters and where they are mentally, right? And the fact that they are perhaps too beginning to fall apart and fall apart at the seams, so to speak. So there is a nice visual link between character and setting, and also the fact that things are staccato, not quite right. There is a jagged rhythm to the piece when we see the special effects play out, and I think that too adds to a sense of tension that we are experiencing, and that is, I think, a sense of tension that is manifest, that is supposed to represent also a kind of tension that is existing inside, interior, within the characters themselves. And so I think even though the special effects and the sets might seem a bit ropey or a bit cheap, low budget, still I think there's room to see them as being some kind of having some kind of function or purpose that can help us, the viewers, better or further appreciate and have fun with the messages of this film, Dark Star, and what the filmmakers, I think, are trying to say with this, apart from it being a really fun sci-fi entertainment, which I think it is, of course. So that is Dark Star, or my comments on Dark Star. Okay, my friends, let me end it there, and I hope you enjoyed that conversation about Dark Star. Please, this is a film that I think has potential for many comments and thoughts. It is a cult favorite, I understand, and so you might have comments or thoughts that are much different than mine. You might disagree with what I have had to say. Please feel free to say so in the comments. I'm very welcome to that. You know, I am very open to the fact that there are many opinions out there, not just my own, of course, and so your opinions are just as, if not more, valid than mine. And I'd love to hear what it is you have to say. That's the whole point of this, is to have fun and have great conversations about cinema. where we agree and where we disagree, and we'll still remain friends. So, my dear friends, if you have any thoughts or comments about this film, Dark Star, I'd love to hear about it, and please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. Okay, my friends, with that, the next film I will be talking about is Assault on Precinct 13. So until we meet again, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well. And please, please, please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers. Let there be light.